Have you ever found out someone was lying but couldn't confront them because of how you found out? Every Wednesday for 3 years, I lied to my wife, Kesha. I'm going to hang with the guys tonight, babe. Be back around midnight. In reality, I was actually driving to the cinema to watch movies alone because I just wanted some me time. Well, 2 months ago, my movie was cut short by a technical issue in the theater, meaning I came home earlier than planned. I turned onto our street holding takeout bags for my wife and I, and that's when I saw a black Corvette in our driveway. My heart froze. I turned on my phone and watched back all the footage from our doorbell camera, seeing a man getting out of the car and walking up to the door like he'd done it before. Kesha opened before he could ring. They kissed and his hand went to her neck. My stomach dropped. I wanted to burst through that door and confront them, but I realized that would be too kind. I needed to do something else. Something that would destroy her. So I drove around until 12:30 and walked in with a story about Tony getting drunk. Kesha was showering. Hey babe, how was your night? Good. You know how it is. The next 2 Wednesdays, I kept my routine but parked down the street at 8:30 to watch. At the same time, the same car pulled up. I zoomed in on the ring footage and that's when it hit me. The man was Callum. Callum, who supposedly moved to Seattle 2 years ago. My knees were shaking, but I took screenshots and sent them to my lawyer to further build my case. When I was confident enough that I had everything basically set up, I dropped the bomb. Kesha was going on about her fake plans for when I left for boys' night when I randomly blurted out, "You know who I miss? Callum. That guy and I used to have so much fun before he moved to Seattle." Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, just for a second. "Yeah, Callum was great. You guys still text though, right? Sometimes." The next morning she woke up different with this nervous energy. She made some phone calls behind closed doors, and since it was Wednesday during lunch, she texted, "What time are you heading out tonight?" She never asked before, so I knew the comment about Callum got her. "Probably 7:30, why?" "Just wondering. The guys doing anything special?" Same old. After work, she was cooking in full makeup. "You look nice," I said. "Just felt like making an effort for you to come home to." But she kept checking her phone and setting it down, then picking it back up. At 7:15, she practically pushed me out. "Don't want you to be late. Tell everyone I say hi." I drove to my regular spot down the street where I watched them. But this time, there was no car that showed up. And at 9:15, Kesha's own car pulled out. I followed her. First stop, Grady's Sports Bar, where she thought I'd be. She walked in confidently, then came out 5 minutes later looking confused, checking her phone, scanning the parking lot. Then she got back in her car. Her second stop, the Dugout. Another sports bar. Through the windows, I watched her walk the entire place, moving table to table, even checking the bathroom entrance area. She showed her phone to a waitress who shrugged. Back to the car, more frantic phone checking. Third stop, Buffalo Wild Wings. She stayed longer this time, 15 minutes. I could see her at the bar, talking to the manager, showing him something on her phone, probably my picture. He shook his head, pointed to their mostly empty tables. Wednesday wasn't exactly prime sports bar night. Fourth stop, the dive bar where Tony actually used to drag us. She went straight to the bartender. I slipped in through the side door, ducked into the hallway by the bathrooms, heard her say, "Every Wednesday night." Group of guys, probably 5 or 6 of them, loud. One of them looks like this. The bartender studied her phone. "Wednesday's our slowest night. I definitely remember a regular group. Sorry." She left looking frustrated, sat in her car for 5 minutes, typing furiously. Then she drove to the AMC Theater. I gave her a 10-minute head start, then walked in through the side entrance. She was at the concession stand, talking to the teenage manager. Showed her phone again. He pointed toward the theaters. She went to check each one, opening doors, scanning the sparse Wednesday night crowds. I went back to my car. 20 minutes later, she emerged looking defeated. Sat in her car for another 10 minutes. Through her rear window, I could see her on the phone, gesturing with her free hand. Probably calling Callum, probably saying she couldn't find me anywhere, that maybe I knew, that Wednesday nights might not be safe anymore. She even drove by 2 more bars on the way home. Quick stops, desperate checks. When I got home at my usual time, she was on the couch with wine, trying to look casual, but her leg was bouncing. "How was your night?" Studying my face. "Good. Same as always." "Yeah? Where exactly did you guys go?" "Grady's." "Why?" Her jaw clenched. "No reason. Just curious. Was it busy?" "Pretty dead, actually." "Who all was there?" "Haven't heard their names in a while." "The usual crew." Each answer made her fidget more. She stood abruptly. "I'm tired. It's been 2 hours." I could hear her upstairs on the phone, voice low but urgent, probably with Callum, probably trying to figure out if I know, if Wednesday nights are blown, if mentioning his name was a message. The next day, I was ready to confront her. I came downstairs and found Kesha already at the kitchen table with her coffee, scrolling through her phone with dark circles under her eyes. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from her, watching her thumb move faster across the screen. "Who were you calling last night?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and steady. Her hand froze and the mug stopped halfway to her lips, coffee steam curling between us. She set it down carefully and forced a laugh that came out too high. "Just work stuff. You know how it is with the quarterly reports coming up." Her eyes wouldn't meet mine, and she picked up her phone again, but I could see her hands shaking slightly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone, already open to the screenshot I'd saved weeks ago from our Ring doorbell footage. The image showed Callum walking up our driveway in perfect clarity, his face unmistakable in the porch light. I slid it across the table toward her and watched the color drain from her face like someone had pulled a plug. Her mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. It's not what it looks like." She pushed the phone back toward me and stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "Where do you really go on Wednesday nights?" Her voice got louder and she pointed at me. "You weren't at Grady's because I checked, so where were you?" I leaned back in my chair and told her the truth. "I go to the movies alone because I wanted some time to myself." Her face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. "The movies? You've been lying to me for 3 years about going to the movies?" She laughed, but it sounded more like choking. "That's your big secret?" The argument built like a storm rolling in, her voice getting higher and mine staying deliberately calm, which seemed to make her angrier. She grabbed her purse and keys off the counter, knocking over the sugar bowl in the process. "I need time to think." The door slammed hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway, then pulled out my phone and called Miranda Schultz, the divorce attorney I'd been working with for the past month. She answered on the second ring, and I told her we were moving forward today. She'd been expecting my call and immediately started listing everything I needed to do. I grabbed a notepad and started writing as she talked. "Photograph every valuable item in the house, get close-ups of serial numbers on electronics, document the condition of furniture, copy all financial documents you can access, secure your important papers like passport and birth certificate, change your passwords on everything." I spent the next 3 hours following her checklist like my life depended on it. The camera on my phone got a workout as I went room by room, opening drawers and cabinets, photographing jewelry, electronics, artwork, even the expensive kitchen appliances Kesha had insisted we needed. I found bank statements in her desk drawer and took pictures of every page, then moved to the filing cabinet where we kept tax returns and investment documents. The scanner in the home office ran hot as I made copies of everything. I changed passwords on my email, banking apps, social media, even my Netflix account, found my passport and birth certificate in the safe, and moved them to a locked drawer in my office, along with the backup drive containing all the Ring footage I'd saved. My phone buzzed with a text from Kesha around noon, asking if we could meet at the coffee shop on 3rd Street to talk. I texted back that I could be there at 2, then called Miranda again. She told me recording was legal in our state as long as I was part of the conversation, so I tested the voice recorder app on my phone to make sure it would pick up clearly through my pocket. The coffee shop was half empty when I arrived, and Kesha was already there in a corner booth, 2 cups on the table. Her makeup was smeared and she'd clearly been crying. I started the recorder before I sat down. She grabbed my hand across the table and I let her. "It's been going on for 2 years, but it doesn't mean anything, I swear." She squeezed tighter and leaned forward. "We both lied, right? You with your movies and me with Callum, so we can just forget all of it and start fresh." She actually smiled like she'd found the perfect solution. "We're even now." I pulled my hand back and told her I'd already filed for divorce. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she started crying loud enough that people at other tables turned to stare. "Please don't do this. We can work it out. We can go to counseling. Whatever you want." Her voice got louder with each word until the barista started walking our way. I stood up and left cash on the table for the coffee neither of us had touched. She followed me to the parking lot, still begging, but I got in my car and drove away while she stood there in the rain that had just started falling. Back home, I called the locksmith Miranda had recommended, who showed up within an hour with a knowing look that said he'd done this plenty of times before. He changed all 3 exterior locks in 45 minutes, making small talk about the weather while we both knew exactly why I needed new locks on a Thursday afternoon. I kept the old keys to give Kesha later since Miranda said I couldn't lock her out completely, just require her to knock first. The locksmith handed me 6 copies of the new keys and a receipt that I immediately photographed for my records. Around 7 that evening, I heard a car door slam and looked out to see Kesha getting out of the passenger side of Callum's black Corvette. They walked up to the front door together, and she tried her key 3 times before realizing it didn't work. She started pounding on the door while I stood on the other side watching through the peephole. Callum put his hand on her shoulder and said something I couldn't hear, then stepped forward and rang the doorbell. I made sure my phone was recording through the Ring app before I answered through the speaker. "What do you want?" Callum cleared his throat and I could see him looking directly at the camera. "Hey man, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about everything. I know I betrayed our friendship and I feel terrible about it." His voice sounded rehearsed like he'd practiced this speech in the car. "I know there's nothing I can say to make it right, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." Kesha pushed him aside and leaned toward the camera. Just let us in so we can talk about this like adults. I told them both that all communication needed to go through lawyers from now on, and watched them stand there for another minute before walking back to his car. Kesha stood frozen for about 10 seconds before she pushed past Callum and started banging on the door with her fist. I watched through the peephole as she dug through her purse and tried her key again like maybe the first 3 tries were wrong. She turned to Callum and said something I couldn't hear, but her hands were waving around and pointing at the house. He touched her arm, and she jerked away from him and went back to pounding on the door. I walked upstairs and started gathering some of her clothes from the dresser while I could hear her yelling my name from outside. After about 5 minutes, the pounding stopped, and I looked out the bedroom window to see them both sitting in his car with the engine running. 20 minutes later, she came back alone with a gym bag and rang the doorbell. I told her through the speaker she had 15 minutes to grab what she needed. She used her old key to try the lock one more time before asking me to open it. I unlocked it and stepped back into the kitchen while she rushed upstairs. I could hear drawers slamming and hangers scraping across the closet rod. She came down with the bag stuffed full and 2 armloads of work clothes still on hangers. She looked at me standing by the kitchen counter, but didn't say anything, and went back up for another load. 3 trips total, and then she stood by the door looking at me. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but she just shook her head and left. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and Tony's name showed up. He asked if I wanted to grab a beer for real this time, because he'd heard from his cousin that Kesha and I were having problems. I met him at the dive bar he actually went to and sat in a booth in the back corner. He ordered us both beers and waited until the waitress walked away before asking what was going on. I told him about the Wednesday movies first, and he started laughing until he saw my face. Then I told him about Kesha and Callum. His beer stopped halfway to his mouth, and he set it down hard enough that foam sloshed over the edge. He asked how long I'd known, and when I said 2 months, his eyes got wide. I explained about following her that Wednesday night to all the bars, and he shook his head and said he'd noticed I never seemed drunk when I claimed we'd been drinking all night. He told me I could crash in his spare room if I needed to get out of the house for a while. The offer hit me harder than I expected, and I had to look away for a second. We stayed until the bar closed, and he drove me home since I'd had too many beers to drive myself. The next morning, Miranda called while I was in the shower and left a voicemail saying she had great news. I called her back, and she said the ring footage combined with Callum's recorded admission through the doorbell gave us an incredibly strong case. She'd already filed all the paperwork, and Kesha should get served within 48 hours. She also gave me the name of a private investigator she'd worked with before named Elias Burnett, who specialized in documenting infidelity. I called him that afternoon, and he came to my house the next day. He was in his 50s with gray hair and looked like he'd been a cop, which turned out to be true. He'd retired after 25 years and started doing PI work mostly for divorce cases. I showed him the ring footage and gave him Kesha and Callum's information. He took notes in a small notebook and said he'd start surveillance immediately. 3 days later, he called with his first update. He'd followed Kesha to a Marriott downtown during her lunch break, where she met Callum in the lobby. They went up to room 412 and stayed for an hour before leaving separately. He had photos of them entering and leaving with timestamps. He'd also discovered they'd been meeting there every Tuesday and Thursday for at least 6 weeks, based on his conversation with the desk clerk who recognized their photos. The scope of it hit me hard because I'd been focused on Wednesdays, but this was happening multiple times a week. Elias said he'd keep documenting and would have a full report for Miranda by the end of the week. I hung up and made an appointment with a therapist Miranda had suggested named Kira Waters, who specialized in betrayal trauma. Her office was in a small building near the hospital, and I sat in the waiting room filling out paperwork about my mental health history. Kira was younger than I expected, with short brown hair and glasses. She had me sit on a leather couch while she sat in a chair across from me with a notepad. I started telling her about the Wednesday movies, and she asked how long I'd felt like I needed that time alone. When I really thought about it, I realized it had started around the same time Kesha began working longer hours, and we'd stopped doing things together on weekends. Kira helped me see that the movies weren't the problem, but a symptom of already feeling disconnected from my wife. We talked for the full hour, and I scheduled another appointment for the next week. 2 days later, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a call from Kesha. I let it go to voicemail and listened to it in my car at lunch. She was screaming about being humiliated because a process server had walked into her office in front of all her coworkers and handed her divorce papers. She called me every name she could think of and said I was going to regret this. I forwarded the voicemail to Miranda without responding. Miranda called me an hour later and said we needed to deal with the joint bank accounts immediately. She walked me through the process of legally separating my portion of the funds. I went to the bank that afternoon and moved exactly half of our savings and checking into a new account in just my name. I left Kesha her half, but protected mine from any revenge spending she might try. The bank manager said this happened more than people realized and made sure all the paperwork was correct. A week later, Elias sent me an email with attachments that made my stomach turn. He'd followed Kesha and Callum to a jewelry store where he got photos of them looking at rings together. There were 3 pictures of Callum holding Kesha's hand while she tried on what looked like engagement rings. The timestamp showed this was just 10 days after she'd been served with divorce papers. The speed of it stung more than I expected, because we'd been married 12 years, and she was already shopping for replacement rings. 3 days after getting those ring photos, Miranda called me at work saying Keisha's lawyer had sent over a counter-proposal that was basically comedy gold. I put her on speaker in my car during lunch while she read parts of it out loud, trying not to laugh at how they claimed I'd abandoned the marriage first by lying about Wednesday nights for 3 years. Miranda said she'd already drafted a response, pointing out that watching movies alone wasn't exactly the same as having an affair with someone who supposedly lived in Seattle. She told me not to worry about it because no judge would see those as equal, and hung up to file her response. That afternoon, I had to go back to the house while Kesha was at work to start dividing our stuff for the property settlement Miranda needed. I grabbed boxes from the garage and started in the living room, putting sticky notes on everything marking mine, hers, or joint property that we'd need to sell. The TV was mine since I'd bought it before we met, but the couch was joint since we'd picked it out together for our first anniversary. I worked through each room methodically, trying not to think too much about the memories attached to everything. The bedroom closet was the worst part, because that's where I found our wedding album shoved behind some old winter coats. I sat on the floor flipping through pages of us looking so happy and young, not knowing that 12 years later she'd be trying on engagement rings with my former friend while we were still legally married. I put the album in the joint property pile and kept working through boxes of old photos and cards we'd saved over the years. My next therapy appointment with Kira was 2 days later, and I spent most of the hour talking about these revenge fantasies I kept having. I told her about imagining myself showing up at Callum's work with all the evidence, or posting everything on social media, or sending the ring shopping photos to Keisha's parents. Kira listened without judging, but reminded me that the best revenge would be moving forward and building a better life without Kesha. She said holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run, and that focusing on practical next steps would be more helpful than fantasy scenarios. We worked on some breathing exercises to use when the anger got too intense and scheduled another session for the following week. 4 nights later, I was watching TV in my apartment when I heard pounding on the door around 11:30. Through the peephole, I could see Kesha swaying on her feet, mascara running down her face, banging with both fists and yelling about throwing away 12 years together. I didn't open the door but grabbed my phone and called 911, telling them my soon-to-be ex-wife was drunk at my door and I was concerned about her safety. The dispatcher said they'd send officers for a wellness check and told me to stay inside. 2 cops showed up within 10 minutes, and I watched through the window as they talked to Kesha, who was gesturing wildly and crying. One officer came to my door while the other stayed with her, and I explained the situation, showing him the active divorce papers and restraining order Miranda had suggested I file. He took notes and said they'd make sure she got home safely, but that she needed to leave immediately. They walked her to her car where a friend must have been waiting because someone else was driving, and the officer gave me a case number for documentation. The next morning, my phone had 15 texts from Kesha, apologizing for showing up drunk and saying she didn't remember much, but her friend told her the cops were involved. I screenshotted everything and sent it to Miranda without responding, and she said this would actually help our case since it showed unstable behavior. Later that week, I got a Facebook message from someone named Owen Haynes, saying he needed to talk to me about Callum. I didn't recognize the name, but his profile said he worked at a tech company downtown, so I messaged back asking who he was. He said he was Callum's roommate, and had just found out Callum was seeing a married woman and wanted to help however he could because he was disgusted by the whole situation. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next day, where Owen showed up looking genuinely upset about everything. He told me Callum had been living in town the entire time, working remotely for a Seattle company, but using that as cover for the affair. Owen pulled out his phone showing me their lease agreement from 2 years ago, utility bills with both their names, even photos from their apartment showing Callum clearly living there recently. He said Callum would leave every Wednesday saying he was going to play basketball, but Owen had started putting pieces together after overhearing phone calls. Owen offered to testify about everything he knew and gave me his number to pass along to Miranda. A week later, Miranda's office called Owen in for a formal deposition, where he provided dates, receipts, and even text messages, where Callum mentioned meeting someone special, but being complicated because of her situation. His testimony completely destroyed any chance Keisha had of claiming this was some recent thing, or that she didn't know Callum was in town. The court reporter typed up everything, while Owen went through 2 years of evidence that lined up perfectly with our timeline. The next day, Keisha tried a new approach by having her mother call me, which I should have expected but somehow didn't see coming. Her mom started crying immediately, saying she didn't understand what was happening and that Kesha had made mistakes, but we could work through anything after 12 years together. I stayed polite but firm, telling her she didn't know the full story and that her daughter had been having an affair for 2 years with someone who pretended to move away. She tried to argue that everyone deserves forgiveness, but I ended the call and blocked her number too. The friend situation got messy fast once word spread about everything. Some people who I thought would support me said I was overreacting and should give Kesha another chance, while others were completely shocked and cut her off immediately. A few tried to stay neutral, inviting both of us to different events or saying they didn't want to choose sides, which honestly felt worse than picking her. When people started asking me directly what happened, I stopped making up stories and just told them the truth about my Wednesday nights at the movies. Most of them laughed and said they understood needing alone time, which made Kesha look even worse for cheating over something so small. My neighbor said his wife goes to yoga 3 nights a week just to have her own space and nobody thinks that's weird. My cousin admitted he tells his family he's working late sometimes when he's really just sitting in his car listening to music. Everyone had their own version of needing time alone, except none of them used it to have an affair for 2 years. Elias called me while I was at work saying he had something important to show me. I met him at a coffee shop where he pulled out his laptop and showed me screenshots from a real estate website. There were saved searches under an account that traced back to Kesha's email, all for 2-bedroom apartments in the nice part of town. The search history went back 3 weeks and showed they'd already scheduled 4 different viewings. One listing had notes about good school districts, which made my stomach turn since we never had kids. Elias had photos too of Kesha and Callum walking into apartment buildings with a woman in a blazer who was clearly a realtor. They were holding hands in one photo, and in another, Callum had his arm around her waist while they looked at floor plans. The timestamps showed these viewings happened during her supposed work meetings. Miranda called that afternoon to schedule prep for our first mediation session next week. She had me come to her office where she spread out all our evidence across the conference table: bank statements, ring footage screenshots, Owen's deposition transcript, the new apartment hunting photos from Elias. She walked me through what would happen step by step, how the mediator would try to keep things civil, but Kesha would probably cry and play victim. Miranda practiced questions with me for 2 hours, teaching me to answer without getting emotional or defensive. She showed me how to sit, where to look, how to keep my hands still on the table. The mediation happened at a neutral office building downtown. Kesha showed up in a black dress looking like she was going to a funeral. The mediator was an older woman who started by explaining the rules and goals. We sat at opposite ends of a long table with our lawyers beside us. 20 minutes in, Kesha started crying when we discussed splitting the house. She kept saying she never meant for things to go this far, looking at me instead of the mediator. Her lawyer had to remind her 3 times to address the mediator, not me. When we got to retirement accounts, she completely broke down and had to leave the room. The mediator called a 15-minute break, but kept the clock running on our paid time. Kesha came back with red eyes and shaky hands, trying to argue she should keep her full retirement since she'd been contributing longer. Miranda pulled out the folder with the apartment hunting evidence. She laid out each photo one by one on the table, explaining how Kesha was actively planning a future with another man while claiming she wanted to work on our marriage. The mediator studied the photos and made notes on her pad. Kesha's lawyer tried to argue the photos didn't prove anything, but the mediator cut him off, saying it showed bad faith negotiation. She wrote something lengthy in her notes and underlined it twice. That night was Wednesday, and I actually went to the movies for real. I bought a ticket for the 7:30 showing and got my usual popcorn and soda. The theater was pretty empty like always on Wednesdays. I sat in my regular seat in the back row and watched the whole movie without checking my phone once. It felt different sitting there knowing I didn't have to lie about it anymore. After the movie, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes. My phone buzzed with a text from Kesha saying she missed her best friend and asking if we could talk without the lawyers getting involved. She said she knew I was hurting, but we'd been together 12 years, and that had to count for something. I took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Miranda without typing anything back. Miranda replied within 5 minutes saying good job and to keep ignoring direct contact. The second mediation session was scheduled for the following week. Kesha showed up looking more put together this time, clearly coached by her lawyer to stay calm. She kept her hands folded and spoke only when asked direct questions. We made progress on dividing the furniture and personal items. She wanted the dining room set her parents gave us, and I didn't fight it. I asked for the home theater system, and she agreed. We went through everything room by room, making lists of who got what. The house sale came up again, and this time we agreed to list it at market value and split the proceeds after paying off the mortgage. Her lawyer pushed for her to stay in the house until it sold, but Miranda shut that down fast. I started looking at apartments online that night. Found a nice 1-bedroom place closer to my office with a gym and covered parking. The rent was less than half our mortgage payment. I scheduled 3 viewings for the weekend and drove by each building after work to check out the neighborhoods. One was above a coffee shop, which seemed perfect for Saturday mornings. Another had a view of the park where people were always jogging or walking dogs. The third was in a quieter area with tree-lined streets and looked peaceful. Kira and I met for our regular session where we talked about the holidays coming up. Thanksgiving was in 3 weeks and Christmas right after, times when Kesha and I always hosted both our families. Kira helped me write scripts for telling relatives about the divorce and setting boundaries about not discussing it at gatherings. We practiced saying no to family members who might try to push us back together or take sides. She suggested I make my own plans this year, maybe travel or volunteer somewhere instead of dealing with family drama. 2 days later, Miranda called with news that made my jaw drop. Kesha's lawyer sent a proposal where she wanted to buy out my half of the house so she and Callum could move in together. The pure nerve of it made me pace around my living room for 10 minutes before I could even respond. Miranda stayed quiet on the phone while I processed the idea of Callum sleeping in what used to be my bed. She finally said we should think about it if they offered the right price, since it would save us listing fees and waiting for buyers. I told her I needed time to think, but honestly, the thought of them playing house in our home made me sick. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept picturing them repainting the walls and putting up new pictures where our wedding photos used to hang. The next morning, Miranda called back saying they bumped up their offer to $20,000 over market value. My hands shook as I did the math on what that would mean for my fresh start. It was more money than I expected and would give me enough for a nice down payment somewhere else plus a safety net. Miranda said they seemed desperate to close fast, which gave us leverage to push for even more. After 3 days of back and forth, they agreed to $35,000 over market, which was almost stupid money, but Callum apparently had family money to throw around. I signed the papers at Miranda's office, feeling weird about profiting from their affair, but also knowing I deserved every penny after what they put me through. The final mediation session happened the following week in a boring conference room that smelled like old coffee. We went through every last detail like robots checking boxes on a list. The mediator read through retirement account splits while Kesha stared at the table, and I watched the clock. We argued for 20 minutes about who got the good coffee maker, which felt so small compared to everything else, but somehow mattered in that moment. She wanted the dining room set her parents gave us for our 5th anniversary, and I didn't fight it. I asked for the tools in the garage, and she agreed without looking up. We split the Christmas decorations down the middle, which felt sad since we'd collected them together over the years. The mediator moved through car titles and insurance policies like he'd done this 1,000 times before. After 3 hours, we'd divided 12 years into 2 neat piles of stuff. Kesha caught me in the parking lot after, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying in her car. She said she never meant for things to go this far, and that she thought we could work through anything. I told her that was the whole problem because she never thought about what would happen when I found out. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back and said, "All communication goes through lawyers now." Her face crumpled, but I got in my car and drove away without looking back. That weekend, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from work. The place was smaller than our house but had big windows and came with a storage unit in the basement. I started packing that same day, and each box felt like cutting another tie to my old life. The kitchen stuff went fast since I was only taking half, but the books took forever since we'd mixed our collections years ago. I found our wedding album in the bedroom closet and sat on the floor staring at it for 10 minutes before tossing it in the donation pile. Tony came over with pizza and helped me wrap dishes in newspaper while making jokes about bachelor pad decorating. Moving day came 2 weeks later on a Saturday that was way too hot for lifting furniture. Tony showed up at 7 with his truck and 2 guys from his work who needed beer money. We loaded everything in 3 hours with me trying not to think about this being the last time in the house. As we pulled away, I saw Callum's black Corvette already turning into the driveway, like he'd been waiting around the corner. Tony saw it too, and cranked up the radio so I wouldn't have to talk about it. The new apartment felt empty even after we brought everything in, but I didn't care. I set up the home theater system first and tested it with a movie I'd wanted to watch for months. Being able to watch whatever I wanted whenever I wanted without lying about it felt better than I expected. The guys stayed to help arrange furniture and hang the TV mount while drinking the beer I'd promised them. After they left, I sat on my new couch in my new place and felt something between scared and free. 3 weeks passed before the divorce papers were ready for final signatures. It happened on a Tuesday morning at the courthouse in a room smaller than my new bedroom. The judge barely looked up as he signed the decree, and just like that, 12 years ended with a pen stroke. Miranda called an hour later to confirm everything was filed and official. I was sitting at my desk at work trying to focus on spreadsheets when she said I was officially single again. The rest of that day, I went through the motions of normalcy while my brain tried to process that Kesha wasn't my wife anymore. That night, I updated all my emergency contacts at work and changed my beneficiaries on my life insurance. Each form felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that I'd given away without thinking. I changed my relationship status online, which prompted texts from people I hadn't talked to in years. Some offered sympathy, and others shared their own divorce stories like we were in some weird club now. I spent an hour updating billing addresses and removing Kesha from shared accounts we'd forgotten about. Even changing my Netflix password felt like a tiny victory in taking back control. 2 days later, I had my session with Kira, where everything I'd been holding back came pouring out. She let me talk for 20 minutes straight about trust, and how I wasn't sure I'd ever let anyone close enough to hurt me again. We worked through why I'd hidden my movie nights in the first place, and how that connected to deeper fears about being seen as weak for needing alone time. Kira helped me see that the right person wouldn't make me feel bad about needing space to recharge. By the end of the session, I could imagine maybe dating again someday, if I found someone who understood that independence didn't mean I cared less. She gave me homework to write down what I actually wanted in a partner, instead of what I thought I should want. Walking out of her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. 3 weeks later, Tony called me while I was assembling new bookshelf in my apartment and asked if I wanted to meet someone. His cousin had a friend from work who was single, and Tony thought we might hit it off. I wasn't ready but agreed anyway because Tony had been checking on me every few days since the divorce. The blind date happened at an Italian place downtown, where the woman kept asking about my hobbies and I kept forgetting to eat my pasta. She was nice enough and laughed at the right moments, but I spent most of dinner thinking about how Kesha used to steal bites off my plate. When she suggested coffee after dinner, I made an excuse about an early meeting, and we both knew there wouldn't be a second date. Tony texted me later asking how it went, and I told him I appreciated him trying but needed more time. 6 months passed with me settling into new routines and learning to cook for one person instead of two. I was picking out avocados at the grocery store when I saw Kesha by the deli counter ordering lunch meat. She spotted me before I could leave, and we both froze for a second before she walked over with her basket. Her left hand had a diamond ring that caught the fluorescent lights, and I knew without asking it was from Callum. We talked about the weather and how the old neighborhood was doing while carefully avoiding anything real. She mentioned they were renovating the kitchen, and I said that sounded nice even though I'd always loved that kitchen the way it was. After 3 minutes of painful small talk, we said goodbye, and I watched her walk to the checkout with her ring catching the light with every gesture. That Wednesday, I decided to try something different and looked up hiking groups online. The local outdoor club met every Wednesday evening for sunset hikes on different trails around town. I showed up at the trailhead with new boots that gave me blisters within the first mile but kept walking anyway. The group had about 15 people of different ages who all seemed to know each other already. They asked what brought me to the group, and I said I was trying to be more active, which was easier than explaining the real reason. We hiked 4 miles that first night, and I could barely walk the next day, but signed up for the following week anyway. After 3 months of Wednesday hikes, I knew everyone's names and favorite trails. The group leader always brought extra water for newcomers, and one woman always shared her homemade trail mix with anyone who forgot snacks. It was nothing like sitting alone in a dark theater, but somehow filled the same need for routine and escape. A package arrived from Miranda's office with a handwritten card on her official letterhead. She wrote that I was one of her most prepared clients ever, and that she wished more people documented everything the way I had. The card felt weird to frame, but I did it anyway, and hung it in my home office next to my diplomas. Every time I saw it, I remembered those weeks of screenshots and evidence gathering that had seemed so important at the time. Kira suggested during our next session that we could scale back to monthly meetings since I was doing so well. She said I'd developed healthy coping mechanisms and was processing the divorce better than most of her clients. We spent that session talking about what I wanted in future relationships, and she helped me see that my need for alone time wasn't something to hide. The woman from hiking group started walking next to me during our Wednesday hikes, and we talked about books and movies while navigating the trails. She mentioned loving to watch movies alone sometimes, and I told her about my Wednesday tradition without the shame I used to feel. After a month of hiking together, she suggested dinner, and I actually wanted to say yes this time. She understood when I said I needed to go slow and didn't push for more than I could give. We started with coffee dates that turned into dinners that eventually turned into her keeping a toothbrush at my apartment. She never complained when I wanted to watch a movie alone, and sometimes joined me with her own popcorn. A full year after signing those divorce papers, I realized I hadn't thought about Kesha in weeks. My apartment felt like home with my pictures on the walls and my furniture arranged exactly how I wanted it. Wednesday hikes had become something I looked forward to instead of just a replacement for movie nights. The woman from hiking group was at my place making breakfast while I read the news on my tablet. Life had gotten smaller and simpler, but also more honest than it had ever been with Kesha. Sometimes I drove the long way to work just to see how the old neighborhood looked. The Corvette was usually in the driveway next to Keisha's car, and the lawn looked exactly the same as when I'd cut it every Saturday. They'd painted the shutters blue, which Kesha had always wanted, but I'd thought would look terrible. Seeing them living their life didn't hurt anymore, because I was finally living mine without having to lie about what I needed. That's all I've got for today. Appreciate you listening in. Feels like talking with a friend every time. Stick around and we'll do it again soon.